first speaker, Todd Harpel. Todd, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Patrick. Today I'm going to be talking about navigating the pros and cons of structured cabling versus a top-of-rack architecture in the data center. And as Patrick mentioned, I am today presenting on behalf of the Communication Cable and Connectivity Association. And for those of you not familiar with who the CCCA is or what we do, we are a nonprofit association that addresses things like quality, design, environmental, and even safety issues with regard to communication cabling infrastructure. And our primary mission is education, and this is part of the reason that we're sponsoring this webcast today. Our members include all of the companies that are represented here on the screen. They are leading manufacturers of cable, connectivity, distribution channels in our market, as well as raw material suppliers to all of these companies. So that's who the CCCA is. But the main topic of the day today is really data centers, and specifically the data center configuration and why it matters today. Certainly as data centers become very complex, the design of the cabling system and the topology that's used become a critical component of how the network performs and how the data center performs. So things like bandwidth, scalability, and virtualization all have an impact on cabling configuration choices, and conversely, your cabling configuration choices can affect the scalability and things that happen in the data center. Things like power and cooling budgets have to be examined, and cable management shouldn't be overlooked when we talk about the data center configuration and architectures that are used. But what we're really talking about today is the pros and cons of the different solutions that are available for the data center today. So there are several configurations that are commonly referred to when we talk about data center infrastructure design. There's the dedicated network row, where you have central switching for your network that's connecting all of the components of your data center, and that incorporates a patching area for making those various connections. More commonly, we've seen middle of row or end of row architectures where the network connections are all housed within the middle or end of a row of cabinets, and the rest of the cabinets or racks have all of the servers that are running the applications in our data center, or perhaps are part of the storage networks. In those architectures, there is a structured cabling system that's used to connect the various cabinets or racks that house the switches as well as the servers themselves. And generally, the network components are housed in their own cabinet or their own rack, either in the middle or the end of the row of those servers. So those are the more common configurations that we've seen for probably the past 5-6 years. One of the more recent introductions in the architecture was the introduction of the top-of-rack configuration, in which the switches are now located at the top of each rack or cabinet of servers, and there's a direct connection between the switches and the servers, and then all of those switches are connected back to your core network via optical fiber. But the point I want you to walk away with today is that there really is no single end-all solution. None of these architectures is always right for every data center, and we're going to look at the different configurations and their pros and cons. So I mentioned several times in that middle of row, end of row architecture the term structured cabling, and in the data center context, structured cabling really is designed as patch panels that are connected with permanent or fixed links to the switches and to the servers in the different parts of the architecture. So you're making these connections in between the switch and the server via a set of patch panels that represent the server ports and the switch ports. Typically, those patch panels are located either at the end or the middle of the row, as I mentioned, and they're in a separate cabinet or rack. All the changes that we're making between the different application servers and the network subsegment that they need to be connected to are made via this central patching area using patch cord, maybe a fiber optic patch cord or a copper patch cord. The real goal of this configuration or this structured cabling is creating an any-to-all configuration, which really means that you're able to route or connect any application server to any switch within the network, specifically switches that may be part of a sub-network that needs to be managed separately. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The TIA 942 data center standard really promotes the idea of utilizing structured cabling in various subsegments of your data center design. It really defines the minimum requirements that are needed to support all of your applications and all of your network types. It actually has a built-in redundancy mechanism that would be supportive of growth and defines specific functional areas in which you have the patching and the distribution of the different connections located in one area and all of your subsegments or all of your network equipment connected separately. So really the goal of the TIA 942 data center standard was to create a common architecture that would be flexible enough to support all of the different types of networks, all the different types of applications, and some of the growth that we're going to be anticipating because data centers are very much a dynamic environment. So data centers and the 942 standard really are focused around a structured cabling approach. When we talk about top-of-rack environments, there's a little bit different way of utilizing or creating these connections between our network layer and our application layer. In this instance, what we're seeing is small 1 or 2 rack unit, lower port count, what we call sometimes edge switches, placed at the top of each server rack or cabinet. In many cases, you'll actually put in at least 2 for dual networks for redundancy. And you're connecting directly between that switch and that server, utilizing different types of connections. Today, in a 10 gigabit environment, you're probably using an SFP Plus or a QSFP direct attach copper cable assembly or an active optical assembly. And more recently, if you are using a 10 gigabit connection, now that there is 10 gigabit Ethernet equipment for twisted pair or 10G-base-T switches and servers available, you're using an RJ45 modular patch cord directly between your switch and server. So you're really going back to a higher density distribution or aggregation layer with optical fiber from the very top of the rack, that switch at the top of the rack, to your network layer. So the top of rack really implements many more switches, and those switches are dedicated to the individual rack or cabinet that they are serving. So why would you use a top of rack configuration? Well, in today's high performance environments, many of your top of rack proponents will say you've got very high performance servers that are being virtualized and they're running multiple applications. Therefore, the I/O port on that server needs to be upgraded to a very high speed. In many cases, it's 10 gigabits per second now. And up until very recently, you only had 2 choices for 10 gigabit connections to those servers. So that would be the SFP Plus direct attached copper or an optical fiber. And optical fiber connections tended to be a little bit more expensive. So many times we're seeing those high performance environments utilizing direct attached copper connections, which have a limited distance associated with them, about 7 meters. A top of rack architecture really is ideal for modular rack at a time deployment. For example, if you are installing a whole cabinet full of servers that are dedicated to a single application or perhaps a single customer, and you want to manage that as a subsegment of your network, that would be ideal for a top of rack environment. And it does enable that rack level management. In some cases, you're going to need that for security's sake. It does reduce the amount of structured cabling, and that's something we hear from top of rack proponents, is that you do not need to spend the dollars to pre-cable the data center environment to make the connections, because you're making all of your connections, or the vast majority of them, within the same rack or cabinet. It does support what we call east-west server-to-server traffic. In other words, if you have various servers that need to be able to communicate with one another, which is very important in a virtualized environment when you're shifting applications from one server to the next, That top-of-rack environment, it makes it very easy to do that because you're having two servers connected to the same switch right at the top of the rack. And, of course, this is recommended by several of the major switch manufacturers today. But we should look at the manageability and scalability concerns or considerations when we talk about this type of a deployment with the top-of-rack architecture. It does eliminate that convenient central patching area. Instead of making all of your changes within one cabinet or one rack, no matter where the server is located or the switch is located, you now have to go to any one of those cabinets throughout the data center where you need to make that change in that connection. That can be time-consuming in large data centers with more ground to cover. More importantly, it does not keep your servers and your switches in a separate location. Many organizations have two separate parts of their infrastructure supported by two different groups. The network portion, which is the switches, are supported by one group of individuals, and the servers, or the applications, are supported by a different group of individuals, and they want to be managed, or they prefer to have them managed separately. When you're using a top-of-rack environment, now you're commingling those two pieces of equipment in the same cabinet, and that can run into some policy issue changes that need to take place. That can be overcome, however. There are upgrade impacts when you're talking about a top-of-rack environment. When you start looking at upgrading, for example, from 1 gigabit to 10 gigabit connections in your servers, you need to ensure that the cables or the switches at the top of that rack can support that type of connection speed. And in many cases, what we find is the SFP Plus direct attach connections that do not support auto negotiation. In other words, you need to have a dedicated 10 gigabits port or a dedicated 1 gigabit port because your direct attach connections don't auto negotiate between the different speeds. And that means that you may be having to upgrade a whole switch or a whole cabinet at a time, even if you only want to upgrade a single server's I/O port. So really, one of the things that we talked about, this diagram represents very well the elimination of that central patching area. The left-hand side of your screen shows the structured cabling environment diagram. At the very bottom, you see the server cabinets that are cabled using a structured cabling environment with perhaps Category 6A twisted pair cabling over to your distribution area where your central patching takes place. And in that central patching area, you also have the connections from your access layer switches, and all of those connections are made with patch cords within that same rack or cabinet. With the top-of-rack environment on your right-hand side, you see that there are a lot of switches installed at the top of every server cabinet, and when you have a dual network environment, you're connecting those to two separate aggregation layer switches, so you've got a lot of fiber connections there, but all of your individual network connections to your servers are made within the same rack. That can be convenient on one hand, but on the other hand, if you're trying to sub-segment your network and you need a server in one cabinet that now needs to be connected to a separate part of the network, you may either have to move that server or you may have to create a different connection scheme to get there, and it could create some issues for you. We also need to look at the maintenance and equipment and cabling costs associated with both solutions. The total number of switches that you're installing in a top-of-rack environment really is dependent now on the number of server cabinets that you have, not on the actual number of ports you need to support. So in many cases, or I should say in some cases, you can see that the top-of-rack environment could actually double the number of switches and power supplies that are required, and then you have the maintenance costs associated with that, which we'll look at in just a moment. The top-of-rack environment, as many people will talk about, does save on the structured cabling portion. In other words, you don't have to pre-install or pay for the structured cabling up front. But what is not included in some of the cost analyses are the fact that the SFP Plus direct attach copper assemblies, the cost of those can actually negate some of that savings. And what we have found is structured cabling can typically be about 95% less costly than the addition of all of the switches, the maintenance costs associated with top-of-rack environments. Plus, a structured cabling system generally carries a 15 to 25-year warranty, whereas your direct attach connections, those assemblies typically come with a 90-day warranty. There are also some interoperability issues associated with some of these top-of-rack switches, and specifically the SFP Plus direct attach connections. Most of your big switch vendors, your well-known switch vendors, require that you use their proprietary cable assembly purchased through them or their authorized suppliers. And in many cases, those switches will actually sense whether you've entered or plugged in a third-party assembly, and will disable or put a login error and disable that port if it doesn't receive the right information. So that really locks you into a proprietary solution. If you are using a single switch vendor, you need to use their proprietary cable assemblies to support the connections between the switch and the servers. Interestingly, there was a study done at the University of New Hampshire's Interoperability Lab, and they did some testing on some third-party direct attach assembly manufacturers' products and found that they would perform just fine if they had the correct little code programmed into them, and they would be just fine. In many cases, the cost of those third-party assemblies would be significantly less than the brand name ones. So an open systems architecture really enables more choices, and that's what structured cabling was really designed to do in the first place. Another really important consideration is switch port utilization. If we look at the average data center environment today and we say that there's about a 5 to 6 kilowatt power consumption per cabinet, that supports about 14 servers today in a very common environment. There's a way to do more, there's a way to get more power, but this is a very average power consumption per cabinet estimate. When you look at that and you say, I'm going to install a top-of-rack switch for all of those servers in that, two 32-port top-of-rack switches in a dual network environment represents about 36 unused ports. You're only using 28 out of the 64 ports that you're installing for those 14 servers. And actually, structured cabling, if you were to separate your network switches separately, you could use only the number of ports you need and install the number of switches you need just to support those 28 ports that you actually need a connection to. And even if edge switches are used, you can install a structured cabling system to allow them to be centrally located and fully utilized. So what does that look like? Well, we took a 39 cabinet example as an example of a pretty common sized data center. And we said, if you look at the two examples of top of rack or structured cabling environment, you're looking at a 32-port switch at the top of all of your 39 cabinets. Actually, we're going to do two because we've got a dual network environment for redundancy. So you're installing a total number of 2,496 ports, assuming that you're, again, servicing 14 servers per cabinet. You have 1,092 unused ports because, again, you're installing two switches at the top of every cabinet, all 39 cabinets, and so you have 1,400 unused ports. And if you work your way up through the aggregation layer to the core layer, and you add all the connections that need to be made there, you're talking about 1,500 unused ports out of the 2,944 that you're installing. So almost half, or more than half of your ports are unused in this top-of-rack example. If you're installing a structured cabling environment using a middle-of-row or end-of-row network architecture, you're now installing the number of switches and switch ports that you need to support the number of server ports that you actually have. So you're installing about 35 of those switches with a total number of 1,120 ports. You're utilizing 1,092 of those, so you only have 28 unused ports. And again, as you work your way up through the aggregation switches, you don't need as many to support that number of access layer switches. And again, up to your core. So you have a very small amount of unused ports in this configuration. Again, this is 39 cabinets, 14 servers per cabinet in both of these examples. When we have a lot of switch ports and a lot of switches being installed, we now have a lot of power being consumed because each of those switches has its own power supply, and believe it or not, all of those unused switch ports can still consume power in an idle state. They don't sit there and not consume power. They do consume some amount of power. So when we're installing all of these top-of-rack switches, We're talking about a lot of unused ports, but the power supplies are still needed there and consuming power to support those unused ports. So your power consumption may vary by switch vendor, and the actual power draw could be examined across the entire data center, but what we're seeing is a large amount of power being used to support unused equipment and unused ports. If we look at it from a side-by-side comparison, again, this 39 cabinet example, we're looking at 78 top-of-rack switches with 78 power supplies connecting to 10 aggregation switches with 10 power supplies and 2 core switches. We're talking about 90 power supplies that are consuming power in that environment. With the structured cabling environment, we have half the number of switches needed to support all of those server connections, half the number of 32-port aggregation switches needed to support those, and again, you have about half the amount of power supplies, and you can see how much less power would be consumed in that environment. So if we look at the total picture of a 39-cabinet data center, and we look at all the costs involved, we look at the equipment used to support all of those servers, again, 39 cabinets, 14 servers per cabinet. We've previously listed all the access switches, the aggregation switches, the core switches, all of those components that are needed to support. The total cost of the equipment is $2.7 million. The cabling total that I've listed here for top-of-rack architecture, representative of $240,000, that is the cost of all of the direct attach assemblies that are needed to support the server connections to the top-of-rack switches. And finally, the 3 years of maintenance on all of the equipment that I've listed here means that you have a total cost, including 3 years of maintenance, of about $4.2 million. With a structured cabling environment using a middle-of-row, end-of-row architecture, you are talking about a cabling cost, and in this case, this is the structured cabling cost, utilizing Category 6A unshielded twisted pair connections with patch panels and patch cords of about $110,000. The equipment costs are, as you can see, about half because we're not installing extra ports that we don't need. And the 3-year maintenance cost, again, is going to be significantly lower because you don't have as much equipment installed. The total cost on the structured cabling side is about $2 million. And you can see that it's about half the cost of the top-of-rack architecture being installed, the total savings being about $2.1 million. So that's a significant amount of savings that you would see by using a structured cabling environment versus a top-of-rack architecture. So finally, the takeaways that I mentioned at the beginning of this is that there are instances where top-of-rack does make sense in the right environment. Small server rooms where you have maybe a number of servers that can be housed within the same cabinet or rack as the switches that they're going to be connecting to. Where you need self-contained cabinets, a good example of that would be a co-location data center environment where each individual cabinet or cage is an individual customer, and for security reasons, you want to have their network connection segregated, and the top-of-rack would be very appropriate in that environment. When you need rack-level deployment and management, for example, when you have very specific applications that are going to be housed within the same cabinet and you want to deploy those all at one time, that would be a very appropriate time to use a top-of-rack architecture. And finally, when those unused ports and power consumption can be managed or utilized in a different way. In fact, in many cases, what we've seen is a top-of-rack environment can be used and then overlaid with a limited amount of structured cabling to be able to take advantage of some of those switch ports that are not being utilized directly by the servers in that rack or cabinet. So there is something to be said for structured cabling coexisting with top-of-rack environments. But in general, what we're finding is structured cabling can be a more efficient and cost-effective way to manage data center or data flow in the data center. But there really is no single architecture that's right for every environment, and you need to take advantage of the different methodologies and the different needs of the data center. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I will turn it back over to Patrick to introduce our next speaker.